The other night, I was at a dinner party where I met a man who seemed to have it all figured out. He was the loudest person in the room, but not in an annoying way. More like he was the sun, and we were all just planets caught in his orbit. He talked about his latest projects with this intense magnetic energy, and you couldn't help but feel a little bit impressed by his perceived confidence. But then the conversation shifted. A quiet woman across the table mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd just completed a marathon. It was a small moment of genuine pride. I watched the man's face. It didn't just go blank, it fractured. Within seconds, he wasn't talking about his projects anymore. He was explaining why marathons are actually bad for your joints and how he'd once done a high-altitude trek that was significantly more grueling than any city run. The air in the room didn't just get cold, it got heavy. It wasn't just that he was being a jerk, it was the desperation behind it. It was as if her success had somehow deleted his own. That instantaneous need to step on her moment, to transform a celebration into a competition, wasn't a sign of strength. It was a window into something much more fragile. We often label people like this as simply arrogant or toxic, but that's a surface-level diagnosis. What I was actually witnessing was a flare-up of a silent, pervasive condition that shapes our character long before we reach adulthood. It's a mechanism built in the furnace of our earliest years, and when left unrepaired, it turns a person into a danger, not just to those around them, but to their own chance at ever being truly satisfied. We call it an inferiority complex, but in practice, it looks a lot more like a survival instinct gone wrong.
Yeah, that is just such a perfect real-world example of what we're looking at today. It really illustrates the core of what the father of individual psychology, Alfred Adler, defined as an inferiority complex.
Right, because our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the architecture of that complex. We want to look past those surface behaviors.
Exactly, past the bragging or the passive aggression.
Yeah, and deconstruct the actual cognitive machinery running underneath. Because it's clearly a textbook manifestation of what Adler was talking about, right?
It is. But to do that, we have to establish a very clear baseline. Because when we talk about an inferiority complex in a clinical sense, we have to separate it from just, everyday self-doubt.
Like getting nervous before a big presentation or something.
Right. Or forgetting someone's name and feeling embarrassed.
Yeah.
That is not an inferiority complex.
Yeah.
The clinical definition is really about a persistent, all-encompassing feeling of inadequacy. And it derives from an actual, or crucially, an imagined deficiency.
An imagined deficiency. So it's like a filtering mechanism then. It dictates how data from the outside world actually enters the brain.
Yes, it's a pervasive cognitive distortion. So think back to the man at your dinner party. When he heard the word marathon, his brain did not process that as just data about another person's cardiovascular endurance.
Wow, so he didn't even hear it as an achievement.
No, his internal filtering system intercepted it and translated it into a literal existential threat. The subconscious calculation in his head was, well, if she is strong, it means I am weak. If she is accomplished, I am nothing.
That is so wild to think about. He didn't interrupt her because he just really wanted to talk about high altitude trekking.
Oh, his psychological architecture absolutely demanded that he neutralize the threat. He had to restore his equilibrium.
Okay, I really want to know how that architecture is built because, nobody is born at a dinner party desperately trying to one-up a stranger.
Right.
This machinery has an origin point. Where do we actually find the genesis of this kind of complex?
Well, to find the genesis, we really have to look closely at early childhood development and specifically attachment. Yeah. There's this deeply illuminating clinical case study in the literature about a man named Julian. So Julian is a highly specialized, top-tier surgeon in London. And outwardly, the guy has completely arrived. He is the pinnacle of success.
He's got the prestige, the wealth, all of it.
The respect of the global medical community. But behind closed doors, the reality of his day-to-day existence is starkly different. Before he walks into the operating theater, as he's literally standing at the scrub sink washing his hands, he experiences these severe physical tremors.
Really? But are the tremors related to the medical complexity of the surgery? Surgical anxiety makes sense given the stakes.
That is exactly what you would assume. No, the tremors have absolutely nothing to do with the surgical risk or the patient's anatomy or, a fear of malpractice. He knows the anatomy perfectly.
And what's causing it?
The tremors are the physical manifestation of a phantom shame. It's his deeply entrenched, vibrating belief that he is an imposter who's about to be exposed.
Oh.
He actually described the feeling not as a fear of making a mistake, but as a fear that everyone in the room will suddenly just realize he is entirely hollow.
How does someone who has passed every rigorous medical exam in the world, someone who literally saves lives for a living, maintain the delusion that he's hollow?
Well, the answer lies in a very specific memory from 1994. Julian is 10 years old. He's sitting at this heavy oak kitchen table in his childhood home, and he has just brought home a math exam.
Okay. Yes, he failed it.
The score at the top is 98%. He slides the paper across the table to his father, just, waiting for validation.
I mean, 98% is essentially flawless. You would expect a lot of pride.
Good. But his father didn't react with anger or pride. There was no yelling, no physical intimidation, none of the overt abuse that we typically associate with childhood trauma.
Yeah.
His father just picked up the paper, adjusted his glasses, looked at the score, and asked one single question. What happened to the other 2%?
Just entirely ignoring the 98.
Completely ignoring it.
Yeah.
And then came this very specific silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a sharp, withdrawing silence. His father handed the paper back and just walked out of the room.
Breaking.
And in that tiny, seemingly mundane interaction, the blueprint for Julian's adult life was drafted. And we know this because through cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, Julian's therapists were able to peel back the layers of his current anxiety to find this exact moment.
I want to pause on the CBT aspect for a second, because peeling back layers is a phrase we hear all the time, but I want to know the mechanics of it. How does a therapist actually connect a shaking surgeon in his 40s to a 10-year-old at a kitchen table?
It sounds like magic, but it's very systematic. In CBT, there's a specific diagnostic tool called the downward arrow technique. It's designed to bypass the logical, sort of intellectualizing part of the brain and drill straight down to the core belief.
How does that work in the room?
Well, it starts with a surface-level automatic negative thought. We call it an ANT. For Julian, standing at the scrub sink, the thought is, I am going to fail this surgery.
So the therapist asks, why do you think you'll fail?
No. Asking why often makes the patient defensive, or it just prompts them to list logical rationalizations. Instead, the downward arrow technique asks, if that thought were absolutely true, what would that mean?
Interesting.
Yeah. So the therapist asks, let's assume you do fail the surgery. What does that mean? And Julian replies, well, it means my colleagues will see that I'm not a perfect surgeon.
That's a pretty standard fear of pure judgment.
Exactly. But then the therapist strikes again. And if your colleagues see you are not perfect, what does that mean? Julian says, it means I will lose my position. I won't be respected.
And they just keep going.
They keep going. The therapist repeats, and if you lose your position and respect, what does that mean? This continues, the arrow pointing downward, stripping away the medical context, the financial context, the social context.
Until they hit the bottom.
Until they hit the absolute bottom. Eventually, Julian says, if I am not perfect and respected, it means I am fundamentally worthless. It means I do not deserve to exist.
Wow, so it all just funnels down to a complete lack of inherent value.
Yes. The downward arrow revealed that Julian isn't operating on patients to heal them. He is performing flawless surgeries to aggressively defend against that underlying belief of worthlessness. And the most telling and perhaps the darkest admission Julian made during this process was about his relationship with his patients. He confessed that he actually harbors a deep subconscious resentment toward them.
Wait, he resents the people he is solving?
Right. Because they're vulnerable. They're laying on a table, physically weak, entirely dependent on someone else. And their physical vulnerability acts as a mirror.
Oh, wow.
It reminds Julian of the emotional weakness and dependency he felt as a 10-year-old boy at that kitchen table. A weakness he has spent 30 years basically sprinting away from. Every time he sees a patient need him, it triggers the memory of his own unmet needs.
You know, this is really reminding me of how operating systems work on a computer. Like, if we think about John Bowlby's attachment theory, he talks about early childhood bonds forging our internal working model. I always picture this internal working model as a core operating system, like iOS or Windows, right? And it gets installed in the first few years of life. This OS just runs quietly in the background of your brain. It manages your battery life, it filters your incoming notifications, it dictates how securely you connect to other networks.
That is a highly accurate analogy for what Adler called primary inferiority. He posited that primary inferiority is forged entirely in these early developmental stages.
Okay, so how does the malware get in?
Well, when a caregiver fails to meet a child's needs, whether through overt neglect, or the subtle emotional withdrawal we saw with Julian's father, the child doesn't possess the cognitive development to blame the adult.
Right, because a child's universe is entirely egocentric. Everything that happens is because of them.
Exactly. A 10-year-old cannot sit back and rationalize, oh, my father has a severe inability to express affection due to his own unresolved generational trauma, so his reaction is about his limitations, not my intelligence.
Yeah, no 10-year-old is doing that math. So the child just internalizes the father's withdrawal as a fact about their own nature.
Yes. The child writes a line of code into their operating system. I am the cause of this rejection because I am defective. This is the malware of the inferiority complex.
And that's primary inferiority.
And Adlerian theory points out that this primary inferiority usually stems from a polarity in parenting styles.
What do you mean by polarity?
Well, on one end of the spectrum is the neglectful or rejecting parent. This creates an environment where the child learns that the world is inherently unsafe and unresponsive.
So they have to fend for themselves.
Exactly. They develop a hyper self-reliance built on profound distrust. They believe no one will ever catch them, so they must be completely, perfectly self-sustaining.
Okay, I totally understand how neglect installs that malware, but what about the other end of the spectrum? Because in the literature, they often pair neglect with pampering as the two primary catalysts for an inferiority complex.
Yes.
And I really have to push back on that. I mean, if a child is given absolutely everything, catered to hand and foot, shielded from every disappointment, and told they are the center of the universe, how on earth does that create the exact same psychological fragility as a child who is ignored and told they're worthless?
No.
Yeah, like, how does pampering equal trauma?
Let's use your operating system analogy again. If neglect is installing malware, pampering is like installing a piece of software, but intentionally removing all the firewalls, disabling the antivirus, and then never, ever allowing the system to run a single executable program on its own.
Oh. So the system looks pristine, but it has zero functional capability.
A caregiver who pampers caters to a child's needs to an extreme, almost pathological extent. The child never has to tie their own shoes or resolve a conflict with a peer or experience the natural consequence of forgetting their homework.
Right, the parent just swoops in.
And because they are meticulously shielded from struggle, they are denied a crucial cycle. The cycle of attempting a task, failing, experiencing the frustration of that failure, and then trying again until they succeed.
So they never build the muscle of resilience.
They develop absolutely zero self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is that internal belief that I am capable of affecting my environment and solving problems. A pampered child attributes every success, every comfort to external forces.
Like their parents or just luck.
Or their innate, untested specialness. Therefore, when that child inevitably enters the adult world and faces a complex challenge like a difficult boss, a romantic rejection, a failing project, and the pampering parent isn't there to clear the obstacle, the realization is devastating.
Because they have no internal data proving they can actually survive it.
Exactly. The core cognitive wound flares up, and it is functionally identical to the neglected child. The thought is, I am inadequate. I cannot survive this on my own.
So the behavioral outputs might look different initially, but the root is the same.
Right. The neglected child might become fiercely avoidant, while the pampered child might become deeply demanding and entitled, expecting the world to act as their caregiver. But beneath the entitlement is a screaming, terrified inferiority complex.
So looking back at Julian's story, with his extreme perfectionism and the drive to become a world-renowned surgeon, that feels like a very specific manifestation of this operating system. It's a very Western individualistic response, right? His culture tells him that the way to prove his worth is to stand out, to climb the hierarchy, to be the absolute best.
In individualistic societies, the cultural narrative absolutely supports the idea of the lone conqueror. Julian is trying to outrun his inferiority by building a mountain of accolades so high that the 10-year-old boy at the bottom can no longer be seen.
But Julian's operating system is just one user interface. What happens if you take that exact same internal working model, that deep-seated inadequacy malware, and you install it into a completely different cultural hardware?
The fascinating question.
Like, what if the environment doesn't reward standing out? Does the inferiority complex just disappear, or does it mutate?
Oh, it absolutely mutates. The manifestation of the complex shifts radically depending on the environmental and cultural demands placed on the individual. The core wound remains, but the symptoms adapt to the survival requirements of the local ecosystem.
So to understand this
in Kenji's environment, the threat isn't failing to be exceptional. The threat is feeling to be adequately ordinary.
Just think about the physical, sensory reality of his day. His morning commute on the Yamanote line, it is a rhythmic, mechanical swaying. He is packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other men in nearly identical dark suits.
The sheer density of it.
Yeah, the smell of damp wool, the silence of the train car despite the mass of human bodies. In that highly compressed environment, Kenji's sense of self-worth has nothing to do with outperforming the man standing next to him.
Right.
His inferiority complex is tied to a crushing, visceral fear that he is failing to blend in.
His cognitive filter is scanning for entirely different threats than Julian's filter. Julian scans for anyone questioning his superiority. Kenji scans for anyone noticing him at all.
And it drives him to literally hide. I mean, the most striking detail from Kenji's life is how he handles success. Recently, he was offered a promotion to a section chief role.
A pretty big deal in that corporate structure.
It came with a significant pay raise and more authority. And Kenji turned it down.
Wow.
He didn't turn it down because he didn't want the money or because he lacked the technical skill. He turned it down because the potential shame of failing his team while in a leadership position vastly outweighed any personal financial gain.
The risk to the collective was just too terrifying for him.
Clear.
This is a textbook example of how collectivism reshapes the behavioral output of the inferiority complex. The psychological burden is shifted from the self to the social unit.
And it creates a heartbreaking daily routine. Kenji spends his designated lunch hour sitting in a closed bathroom stall on the 7th floor of his office building.
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there. He isn't using the restroom. He just sits there on the cold porcelain, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, completely still. He uses those 30 minutes simply to breathe without being perceived.
That is profoundly isolating.
Without being observed and evaluated by the collective, his anxiety is a constantly vibrating fear that his ordinariness is somehow a fraud, and that a single misstep will be a betrayal of the national harmony.
The psychological research on Japanese corporate workers bears this out in startling detail, actually. Clinical studies tracking mental health symptoms in this demographic show remarkably high rates of depression, anxiety, and somatic symptoms.
Somatic symptoms, so physical illnesses caused by psychological stress.
Exactly. Physical pain, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, and crucially, the data shows that these symptoms are mediated heavily by extreme self-criticism and a profound, almost total lack of self-reassurance.
Why is the self-criticism so severe, though? I mean, in the West, we have harsh inner critics, but it seems qualitatively different in Kenji's case.
It's different because the mental health attitudes are intensely shame-based rather than guilt-based.
What's the practical difference between the two?
Guilt says, I made a mistake. I did a bad thing. Shame says, I am a mistake. I am a bad thing. In the literature examining collectivist psychological distress, we see the emergence of specific terms like the hated self.
The hated self.
The individual views their own limitations not as just human quirks, but as active threats. Furthermore, we see the concept of family-reflected shame.
Family-reflected shame. That phrase alone carries a devastating amount of weight. It means your failure isn't contained to just you.
For Kenji, failing to perform his duties seamlessly isn't just a personal lack of worth. It is viewed and felt as a structural failure of his entire social unit, his team, his department, his family bloodline.
So the stakes for making a mistake are exponentially higher.
Astronomically higher. Julian making a mistake means Julian's ego is bruised. Kenji making a mistake means his entire lineage loses face.
Wow, the psychological toll of carrying that perceived responsibility is immense.
However, we have to be really rigorous here and avoid painting Japanese culture with a monolithic brush regarding self-esteem. It is not that Japanese individuals simply lack competitive drive or the desire for self-enhancement.
Okay, so it's not a universal trait.
No. The manifestation of the complex depends heavily on context. This brings us to a fascinating experimental analysis conducted by a psychological researcher named Tochika Takata.
What did Takata's experiment look at?
Takata sought to deconstruct the Western stereotype of universal Japanese modesty. He really wanted to know when and where self-criticism actually occurs. So he framed his analysis around two crucial social dynamics, uchi and soto.
Let's define those terms because they seem central to how Kenji operates.
Uchi translates roughly to the inside. It refers to inner, affective relationships. This is your family, your close friends, and in a corporate setting, your tight-knit work team or department.
The inner circle.
Yes. The cultural expectation is that Uchi environments are competition-free zones built entirely on mutual support, shared resources, and absolute harmony.
Soto.
Soto is the outside. It refers to outer, non-effective relationships. Strangers, rival companies, people from different social strata with whom you have no emotional bond.
So what did the experiment do with these concepts?
Takata designed experiments where participants were asked to evaluate their own performance on various tasks, some cognitive, some social, and compared to others.
How did they set up the variables for that?
They manipulated the perceived audience. In one condition, the participants believed their scores would be compared against and shared with members of their uchi, their close peers. In the other condition, they believed they were competing against members of the pseudo-anonymous strangers from rival universities.
Results.
The findings were incredibly counterintuitive if you only view Japan through a Western lens. Takata found that Japanese individuals engage in heavy, almost punitive self-criticism and self-effacement, primarily in uchi situations.
They are more self-critical around the people they are closest to, the people who are supposed to be their safe harbor. Because in the West, your inner circle is exactly where you relax, you drop the modesty, and you pump yourself up. You brag to your friends.
Right. But in the uchi environment, the primary operational directive is maintaining the harmony of the group. If an individual engages in self-enhancement, if they brag, or even just confidently assert their superiority at a task, it threatens the delicate equilibrium of the team.
It creates friction.
It creates friction and potential envy. So the individual proactively engages in heavy self-criticism to lower their own status, ensuring no one else in the circle feels threatened. They shrink themselves to make room for the harmony.
They preemptively hammer themselves down before anyone else has to do it.
Exactly. But here's the critical pivot in Takata's data. When Japanese individuals were placed in pseudo situations, competing against anonymous outsiders where there was no effective bond to protect, the self-effacement vanished. They displayed a capacity for self-enhancement, competitiveness, and a drive for superiority that was statistically equal to North American participants.
Wow. So the drive to win is definitely there. It is just heavily, heavily suppressed in the places where they spend most of their lives. That presents a fascinating paradox. In the West, the inferiority complex makes you terrified of being unexceptional. You feel this desperate, clawing need to prove you are special, like our dinner party guest, or Julian the surgeon. But for Kenji, operating in his uchi environment at the office, the fear is standing out incorrectly. His inferiority malware tells him that if he isn't perfectly average, he is an active danger to the people he cares about. I have to ask, though, considering the rates of somatic symptoms and the isolation of hiding in a bathroom stall, is a collectivist environment inherently more damaging to a person's self-worth than an individualistic one?
It is not inherently more damaging, no. It is simply a different user interface for the exact same underlying operating system. Collectivism and individualism both exact a severe, sometimes lethal toll when an inferiority complex is present.
They just attack from different angles.
Exactly. Individualism isolates the person at the top of the hierarchy, leaving them paranoid, exhausted, and terrified of falling. Collectivism crushes the person under the weight of group expectation, leaving them terrified of stepping even an inch out of line. The psychological pain, the absolute absence of intrinsic self-worth, is identical.
So Kenji, sweating in the bathroom stall, terrified of being perceived, is experiencing the exact same physiological stress response, the same cortisol spike, the same accelerated heart rate as Julian standing at the scrub sink, terrified of being found out.
Biologically and cognitively, the processes are parallel. The environment merely dictates the shape of the defense mechanism.
Okay, so we've seen what happens when the environment forces the inferiority complex inward to protect group harmony. But what happens when an environment is specifically engineered down to its very architecture to reward turning that complex against your peers?
Now we're getting into dangerous territory.
Right. What happens when you build a sandbox that doesn't just allow competition, but basically mandates throwing sand in each other's eyes just to survive? Let's bring this analysis into the modern corporate workplace, specifically in the United States.
We are shifting here from primary inferiority, the childhood wounds, to what Adler termed secondary inferiority. This is the feeling of inadequacy that develops or is heavily compounded in adulthood.
Let's look at the Shark Tanks of Silicon Valley to observe how the myth of meritocracy turns the inferiority complex into weaponized envy. We have the story of Sarah.
Sarah is a great example of this.
She is a lead developer at a major highly prominent tech firm. This is one of those campuses that projects the absolute optics of ultimate wellness, you know? They have hyper-ergonomic chairs, kombucha on tap, and literal soundproof meditation pods in the center of the office.
Which presumably no one uses for actual meditation.
Of course not, because everyone is too busy performing. If you aren't a pod, you aren't writing code, and if you aren't writing code, you are falling behind. Sarah lives a high-definition, meticulously curated performance of success. She wears the right clothes, uses the right management jargon, and projects total control. But she confessed the reality of her routine. She spends her 2.7 a.m. hours wide awake in bed, bathed in the blue light of her phone, obsessively scrolling through the LinkedIn updates of people she went to university with a decade ago.
Seeking out digital comparisons to confirm her own subconscious inadequacy.
It is a compulsion for her. Her inferiority manifests as a desperate need to be the source of others' insecurity. If someone else is visibly insecure, it means she is momentarily safe. She is winning.
It's a zero-sum game in her mind.
But here is the specific vulnerability she shared, and it's chilling. The company uses a public Slack channel to praise good work. When a junior colleague's code is praised in that channel, Sarah doesn't just feel a fleeting sense of professional annoyance.
What does she feel?
She feels a literal physical sting in her chest, a sharp, breath-stealing pain. She described it as feeling like an erasure of her own identity. If this 23-year-old junior developer is good, then Sarah must be obsolete.
The physiological reaction she is describing is not metaphorical. The research into the neuroscience of envy is quite shocking, actually.
Like brain scans.
Yes. Functional MRI scans, where scientists look at real-time blood flow in the brain, have mapped exactly what happens when an individual experiences acute envy.
What lights up?
The anterior cingulate cortex.
Okay, and what does that region do?
It is the exact same region of the brain that processes actual physical tissue damage. If you slam your hand in a car door, the anterior cingulate cortex registers the pain.
Hitting. Yeah.
When Sarah reads a Slack notification praising her younger colleague, that exact same neural pathway fires. Her brain is literally registering the success of another human being as a physical injury to her own body.
Wild. But why? Why would human biology wire us so that seeing someone else succeed causes physical pain? What is the evolutionary advantage to that? It seems like a terrible design.
To understand the why, we really have to look back at our evolutionary history in small hunter-gatherer tribes. In a tribal environment on the savannah, your status within the group was not a matter of ego, it was a matter of literal physical survival.
Because status meant access to resources.
Exactly. Status dictated your access to the best food, the safest sleeping arrangements, and reproductive mates. Resources were intensely scarce. It was a zero-sum game.
So if someone else in the tribe suddenly became a better hunter, they moved up the hierarchy.
And if they moved up, you moved down. And moving down the hierarchy meant you were closer to starvation, closer to being pushed to the edges of the camp where the predators roamed. A drop in status was a threat to your life.
So the brain treats it as life or death.
Because the brain's primary job is keeping you alive, it needed an alarm system powerful enough to force you to pay attention to social threats. It didn't invent a new alarm system. It simply co-opted the one it already had for physical danger.
The pain center.
The pain center. The brain uses physical pain to scream, "Your status is dropping. Do something or you will die."
So when Sarah is sitting in her air-conditioned, ergonomically perfect office and a notification pops up, her ancient tribal brain thinks she's about to be cast out into the wilderness to starve.
Her brain perceives the junior developer's clean code as a threat to her survival. And consumed by the shame of this secret, agonizing competition, she acts out.
How does she respond to the pain?
Ew.
She subtly, methodically undermines her peers. In meetings, she maintains this untouchable, pristine, supportive mentor persona to upper management. But during team stand-ups, she will wait until a junior colleague is presenting, and then she'll ask a highly specific, convoluted technical question that she knows for a fact they don't have the answer to. She doesn't ask it to get the information. She asks it just to watch them stumble. She watches the confidence drain from their face, and in that moment, her own physical pain subsides.
This brings us to a crucial distinction in organizational psychology: the difference between benign envy and malicious envy.
How can envy ever be benign? It sounds inherently negative.
Envy itself is just an emotion, a signal. How it is processed makes all the difference. Benign envy is characterized by a desire to emulate the person you envy.
Emulate them, like copy them.
More like learn from them. It's the feeling of, They delivered a brilliant presentation. It highlights a gap in my own skills. I wish I could do that, so I'm going to study their technique and work harder to improve myself.
Okay, so it's motivating.
It spurs healthy competition, skill development, and ultimately elevates the baseline of the entire team. You want to pull yourself up to their level.
And malicious envy.
Malicious envy is driven by resentment, a feeling of unfairness, and the overwhelming desire to pull the other person down.
Which is exactly what Sarah is doing.
Yes. The focus is not on improving oneself. The focus is on destroying the advantage of the rival. It leads to sabotage, social undermining, withholding critical information, and malicious gossip.
That is toxic.
Sarah is clearly trapped in a cycle of malicious envy. She isn't trying to write better code than the junior developer. She is trying to shatter the developer's confidence so they start writing worse code.
I view Sarah's supportive mentor facade as a kind of corporate Trojan horse. She is weaponizing the modern management best practices, the language of mentorship, the weekly one-on-one check-ins, the performance reviews.
All the things that are supposed to help.
She uses them to deliver malicious envy without getting caught. She can plant devastating seeds of doubt under the guise of constructive feedback.
It is insidious because it is almost impossible for HR to police. She isn't yelling or stealing. She is simply ensuring that no one around her feels secure.
And if we look at the clinical symptoms of an inferiority complex, the hypersensitivity to criticism, the constant comparison, putting others down to masked internal pain, the inability to accept positive feedback, Sarah is hitting every single marker.
Every single one.
But I have to ask a darker question about the environment she is in. We talked about competitive work structures, forced curve performance evaluations, where the bottom 10% are fired regardless of absolute performance, limited bonus pools.
Yes. Those environments are intense.
Given what we know about how these systems trigger the anterior cingulate cortex, do modern corporate structures actually design their environments to intentionally trigger the secondary inferiority?
That is a deep question.
Like, do they want to keep employees like Sarah desperate, in pain, and perpetually working at 2:00 a.m. just to outrun the phantom threat of being obsolete?
That is a deeply cynical question.
Sure.
But sociologically, it holds water. I don't believe there is a cartoonish cabal of executives in a boardroom rubbing their hands together, actively plotting to inflict neurological pain on their developers.
Right. It's probably not that sinister on purpose.
However, the result of systems designed to maximize absolute productivity often relies heavily on leveraging human insecurity. The system finds the vulnerability and exploits it.
So?
Well, a completely secure, emotionally content employee might do their job exceptionally well between the hours of 9 and 5. But a secure employee is far less likely to work an 80-hour week, skip their family vacation, or obsessively check their email at 2 a.m. out of terror.
That makes total sense. The systemic architecture of forced rankings and artificial scarcity inadvertently rewards the exact behaviors driven by the inferiority complex.
The relentless perfectionism, the hypervigilance, the overachievement. The organization reaps the massive short-term benefits of that output, while the individual, like Sarah, absorbs the toxic long-term psychological cost.
The organization gets the code, Sarah gets the chest pain.
Exactly. And the tragedy is that Sarah's behavior ultimately degrades the team's psychological safety, leading to long-term organizational damage. Turnover increases, innovation dies because people are afraid to share ideas.
But in the short term, the complex keeps the engine running at a terrifying speed.
Yes.
So we have toured the absolute destruction caused by this complex. We saw the ruined dinner party where a moment of celebration was actively crushed.
Right.
We saw Julian, the shaking surgeon in London who fundamentally resents the people he heals. We saw Kenji, the paralyzed salaryman hiding in a Tokyo bathroom stall, crushed by the weight of the collective.
And Sarah, the toxic mentor.
Exactly. The toxic mentor in Silicon Valley, poisoning her team from the inside out to soothe her own brain. They all look different. They all exist in vastly different cultures, environments, and tax brackets. But the source code, the internal working model, is identical.
It all stems from that same malware.
So the most critical part of this exploration has to be the solution. How do we rewrite this deeply entrenched code? How do we actually repair the operating system when the malware has been running for 30 years?
It is an incredibly difficult process because we are not talking about learning a new skill. We are talking about unlearning survival mechanisms that have kept the individual safe in their own mind for decades.
So it feels dangerous to them.
To drop the complex feels like dropping your shield in the middle of a battlefield. The consensus among experts, drawing heavily from cognitive behavioral approaches and attachment-based therapies, focuses on a massive shift.
What kind of shifts?
Moving the individual away from their reliance on self-esteem and self-criticism and moving them towards self-reassurance.
Okay, I need us to draw a very hard line between two terms right here, because I think a lot of people hear the phrase self-reassurance and they immediately equate it with self-esteem.
That happens all the time, yes.
And the self-esteem movement of the 1990s, where every kid got a trophy and everyone was told they were incredibly special just for existing, seems like it completely backfired. It didn't cure the inferiority complex, it just created a lot of fragile narcissism.
You are hitting on a vital distinction. Sharon Martin, a prominent psychotherapist who writes extensively on overcoming perfectionism, draws a rigid boundary between self-esteem and self-worth.
Okay.
Self-esteem is almost entirely comparative and therefore incredibly fragile. It is based on your external achievements, your social status, your physical appearance, and how you rank against your peers.
It's, I feel good about myself because I got an A or because I ran the marathon faster.
Highly conditional. And because it relies on external variables that you cannot fully control, it is perpetually unstable. If Julian's hand slips during surgery, if Kenji's team misses a deadline, if Sarah is replaced by the junior developer, their self-esteem doesn't just dip.
It shatters completely.
Yes, the floor falls out from under them. Self-worth, however, is an entirely different construct.
How does self-worth differ?
Self-worth is the intrinsic, immovable belief that you possess inherent value regardless of your output. It is the deep-seated knowledge that you are worthy of love, belonging, and basic respect simply because you are a living human being.
It holds true even when you fail spectacularly.
Exactly. Even when you lose your job, even when someone actively disapproves of you.
Beautiful, but practically. I mean, telling someone like Julian, whose entire neural pathway for 30 years has equated value with absolute perfection, that he has intrinsic value just for breathing, is like telling him the sky's green.
His brain literally cannot process that data. It will reject it as a lie.
So how do we actually build the bridge from the malware to the new OS? What are the actionable cognitive repairs?
It requires meticulous, conscious, and repetitive behavioral intervention. Let's look at Sarah at 2 a.m. She is scrolling LinkedIn, the anterior cingulate cortex is firing, the chest pain is real.
Right. What does she do in that exact moment?
The first cognitive repair is cultivating a growth mindset to short-circuit the malicious envy and convert it into benign envy. The goal isn't to never feel envy. That's biologically impossible.
The goal is changing the processing.
Yes. She has to use a technique called cognitive diffusion.
How does cognitive diffusion work?
When she feels the sting, the old OS automatically thinks, their success means my failure. She must actively stop, acknowledge the physical sensation without judgment like, I am feeling pain right now because of this post, and then forcefully insert a new thought.
Like a manual override.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She has to tell herself, this person's success is not a referendum on my existence. Their achievement is proof that this milestone is possible. What specific skill did they use that I can learn tomorrow?
That is a mechanical, forced reframing. It will probably feel super fake at first.
Oh, it will feel completely fake. But doing it repeatedly, physically, alters the neural pathways over time.
Okay, what is the next step? Because reframing thoughts is internal. Does she have to change how she interacts with the world?
Yes. The next crucial repair is setting firm emotional and professional boundaries. People with inferiority complexes have terrible boundaries because they believe they must be everything to everyone to justify their worth.
So they just say yes to everything.
Right. Boundaries are not walls designed to keep people out. They are the parameters that define what you're responsible for and what you are not.
Give me an example of a boundary repairing the complex.
When Sarah's boss emails her at 9:00 p.m. on a Friday asking for a non-urgent report, her inferiority complex screams, if I don't do this immediately, they will realize I am replaceable.
And she does the report.
Exactly. But setting a boundary means closing the laptop and replying on Monday morning. When you enforce a boundary, you are not just managing your time. You are sending a profound neurological signal back into your own brain.
You are teaching your operating system. My time and my rest have value independent of my productivity.
That leads directly into the concept of self-care.
And I have to challenge this because radical self-care has become a massive buzzword. The language around it can get incredibly fluffy and commercialized.
Yes.
I mean, taking a bubble bath, buying a $40 face mask, treating yourself to a fancy coffee. I'm sorry, but a lavender bubble bath is not going to fix Julian's 30-year phantom shame, and it's not going to stop Sarah from undermining her colleagues. It feels like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
You are absolutely right to challenge the commercialized aesthetic version of self-care. True radical self-care is not a luxury. It is not a reward for hard work. It is a deliberate, often highly uncomfortable behavioral intervention.
So what does it actually look like?
It goes back to attachment theory. If the core wound was a caregiver failing to provide a secure base, radical self-care is the adult actively stepping into the role of that caregiver for themselves.
You have to reparent your own operating system.
Yes. When Julian forces himself to leave the hospital at a reasonable hour instead of obsessively reviewing charts for the 4th time, he is going to feel intense anxiety. The complex will flare up.
But he has to push through it.
By tolerating that anxiety and prioritizing his physical need for sleep over the neurotic demand for perfection, he is forcing his body to enact a reality where he is safe.
He is mimicking the balance of secure attachment.
He is proving to his internal working model through physical action that I am worth taking care of, even when the background program is screaming that he isn't. It is an act of neurological rebellion against the trauma.
You know, I think true cognitive repair must involve something even more terrifying than setting boundaries or taking a day off. If the inferiority complex is an obsessive drive to avoid the feeling of being inadequate, the ultimate cure requires the active willingness to experience failure.
That is the hardest part.
For Julian, for Kenji, for Sarah, failure feels like literal death. It feels like absolute annihilation.
Because to them, failure is not an event, it is an identity.
Exactly. So the repair, the only way to truly rewrite the code is to intentionally allow yourself to fail at something, to drop a ball, to deliver a project that is just fine.
To sit in the excruciating, burning sensation of being completely, utterly ordinary.
Yes. And then you look around the room and you realize you didn't die. The world didn't end. Your heart is still beating. The sky didn't fall.
It's essentially exposure therapy.
You have to conduct exposure therapy on yourself. You have to expose yourself to your own averageness. Because as we look at the psychological landscape we've mapped out today, we have to empathize with the furnace of their childhoods.
They've been through a lot.
The arrogant dinner guest, Sarah undermining her team, Julian shaking at the sink. They are evil people. They are trapped in an exhausting survival loop. Truly secure people don't seek constant comparison. They don't need the room to revolve around them.
They simply focus on their own path, day by day, without the desperate requirement to tear the person next to them down to feel tall.
The ultimate goal of this psychological repair is to reach a state of internal quiet. It is the transition from a life spent constantly, frantically defending your right to exist to a life of quiet, unshakable acceptance.
It's about finding that internal quiet.
We have covered massive ground today. We have looked at how the inferiority complex is, at its absolute core, an outdated, miscalibrated survival mechanism. Whether it creates an arrogant guest dominating a dinner table, an anxious surgeon trembling in London, a paralyzed salaryman hiding in a Tokyo bathroom, or a toxic corporate mentor weaponizing envy in Silicon Valley, it always originates from the exact same unhealed wound.
The underlying operating system is always the same.
It is the terrified child inside, convinced that they are fundamentally defective, desperately trying to manipulate the world into keeping them safe. And as we wrap up this exploration into the architecture of our own insecurities, I want to leave a thought lingering in the air. The people in our lives who triggered the most intense envy, the most blistering frustration, or the hottest anger within us are rarely our actual enemies. Instead, they are simply holding up a mirror. They are reflecting the exact pieces of our own history that we have refused to repair. The truest measure of personal fulfillment and the ultimate defeat of the inferiority complex isn't becoming the smartest or the loudest or the most successful person in the room. It is the quiet, profound ability to exist in a room without the desperate need to conquer it.